Debut at the introduction to today's show. Terry.
Welcome to the Link Online.
Needs a little work.
Well, my name is Mark Montgomery, and we are pleased to bring you news from Canada live on Facebook, here on Fridays at 14:15 hours GMT or 10:15 Eastern Time in Canada.
Well, that was a good start. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, I am Mark Montgomery. That was Terry Haig. And with me is the ever-popular and lovely and handsome Lavon Savants.
Who doesn't have a radio voice.
No.
Who hasn't got a radio.
Hey, by the way, we're also heard on World Radio Paris on the shortwave service from Germany and Kawi 97.5 FM radio in Nigeria.
There you go. Besides, we're the big three here, but in the studio, on the other side of the glass,
The guys that really count.
we have the big three there. We have Benoit Durand, Carl Bélanger, and the mysterious, and the man who has only ever appeared once on the program. Big smile, Pierre Dutil. Maybe we can convince one of these days to get him back in here so you can see what he looks like.
We need a pizza for
Funny
that.
guy. You think I'm funny? Why am I funny?
Anyway, of course, we're here now.
I'm funny? Why am I funny? Tell me why I'm funny.
Are you?
Joe Pesci, one of the greats.
Are you? Yeah. Okay. Are you finished? Okay.
I'm funny.
We have a serious show to run today.
We do,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Well, we got some serious subjects here.
Okay,
Now
sorry.
we're at the end of summer. This is we've had the Labor Day weekend, which usually signals the end of summer, and now the kids are back in school, and the traffic is picked up, and the public transit is more crowded, and there's a lot of things going on. We have, for example, a hurricane. We've got kids in trouble, and we've got an election coming up. Lavon, tell us a little bit more about your story.
Well, Hurricane Dorian is coming our way, and I'll speak with a Canadian meteorologist about what Canadians in Atlantic Canada should expect this weekend.
All right, Terry?
Well, both of us did stories on the state of Canadian kids and youth, and I'll have a story on that and a call for politicians to do something about the problems that young people face.
All right, and as I mentioned, we have coming up very soon the official announcement of a federal election in this country, and there are some new changes in the political landscape this time around that we're going to hear about as well. That's coming up in just a moment here on The Link Online.
Winds over the water.
Whoops.
They're probably...
Normally we'd have a flourish of music, but we'll just presume
we
that
can sing doo-wop, I'm telling you.
We'll just presume that happened. Now, okay, you guys, of course, in the newsroom, we've all been following this situation with the election coming up, and we've had, of course, over the summer, various things happening and related to that. Now, the election call in Canada is expected perhaps next week and certainly the week after. And I was talking to the Canadian Press parliamentary reporter in Ottawa, first of all, about what the political parties were doing behind the scenes as they get set for this election call. But then I asked him also, what is happening publicly? What is going to happen publicly this week as they all prepare for the actual election call?
Winds over the water are going to create large waves. And they're
No,
probably
that's
going to stop things like
the second one.
ferry
Sorry.
between Newfoundland and Labrador during the peak of the storm.
No, it's
But it fits.
that's
It works. It works for your intro about what they're going to be doing. They're going to make large waves. They're going to be heading down the Labrador. That's politicians. There's an election coming.
There are political waves indeed.
It's Kismet. That worked.
No, well, there's a big storm coming. Yes, either politically
That's right.
or otherwise. Do we have what do we have? Do we have the storm or do we have the political thing? Let's run with the storm because you have that. Okay, so this will be Lavon's story about the hurricane which is coming. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about that?
I mean, the good news is Hurricane Dorian, which was a Category 5 hurricane when it hit Bahamas, the strongest ever in recorded history to hit Bahamas. There's like 30 people died in Bahamas, big parts of the Abacus Islands and the big Bahamian Islands, Grand Bahamas wiped out. Thousands of people without homes now. That hurricane then moved on to the Carolinas and hit southern and northern Carolinas, and the good news for us Canadians is that it has weakened a bit to Category 1, and it's heading now for Atlantic Canada. So meteorologists are expecting to hit land, make it landfall, I don't know, early morning of Saturday. And I spoke with a Canadian meteorologist, Doug Mercer. He's a senior meteorologist at the Canadian Hurricane Center in Halifax. And I asked him what are some of the things that he expects to see and some of the things that the Haligonians and the people in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, in
Newfoundland later on.
Newfoundland should expect once the storm hits Canada.
First thing is with the winds. Winds over the water are going to create large waves, and they're probably going to stop things like the ferry between Newfoundland and Labrador during the peak of the storm. And there'll probably be a lot of marine warnings out on Saturday into Sunday. With respect to land impacts with the wind, so last week, post-tropical storm Erin moved into Nova Scotia, and it gave us a high amount of rain, especially around the Bay of Fundy. Basically amounts ranging from 80 to 160 millimeters last week. So now we have a large area in western Nova Scotia where the soil is pretty close to saturated. And now we're going to get upwards of another 150 millimeters of rain there.
So there's nowhere for that rain to go.
Right. It's also going to make the ground very soggy. There's also going to be some local flooding, especially in the smaller streams. And the other thing is if you combine that with trees with leaves on them and high winds. A number of years ago, there was a storm called Arthur that put high winds into the southeastern New Brunswick, like areas around Fredericton and Moncton. And those winds basically pushed the trees over. They didn't snap off. They were pulled out from the roots because they were in soft soil, and basically the winds were strong enough to pull the roots right out of the ground. So we're worried about something like that. And the other thing is if the trees come down and branches get broken off, power outages is going to be a big issue. The wind and the rain for the land and what they can do in combination is the biggest threat. And the area that's under the highest threat is basically Nova Scotia, PEI, and probably Ile de la Madeleine. And for Newfoundland, the biggest threat is going to be the winds.
So local authorities all across Atlantic Canada are preparing for this. For example, Quebec has just pre-positioned hydro crews in the Magdalen Island because last year when they were hit by the hurricane, the power was knocked out and it took a while for them to be able to respond to it. So this time I guess they're learning their lessons and pre-positioning crews and equipment already there. In other places too, people are getting ready. Ships are getting out of the harm's way because they're expecting pretty high waves in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, up to 10 meters in some places. So everybody's bracing for it, and as Doug mentioned, this comes on top of another post-tropical storm. So the area is already really pretty saturated by moisture. The good news, though, is that the high tides are over. So if this storm had come in last week when they were having high tides, it could have been a much worse in terms of the storm surges that they're expecting.
Now I've seen images of the Bahamas, and everything has been flattened, completely flattened. And this is something that people have been talking about for quite some time now. They said the feeling is that these storms are getting more violent, and we're going to have to start building buildings in consequence for that. You won't be able to have the buildings that we have now because they're not designed to withstand 200 kilometer an hour winds, for example,
Up to 300 in some places. I mean, the strength of that, and it all it takes is just a little crack in that structure for that wind to get in and kind of rip things apart. It's just amazing, the force of nature. what it does.
Yeah, because it'll get like under the eaves and lift the whole roof off, for example. And
Doesn't it cost a whole lot more to build a stronger house? And
well, you would think so, but by the same
At some
token,
point, if you have to rebuild every year after, if you have to rebuild a wooden structure after every hurricane, maybe at some point it becomes cheaper just to build like a concrete thing or something that is a lot stronger that's not going to get blown away by any wind.
Yeah. So the typical building standards that we have now and the types of materials and the way even they're designed probably will be changing in the future. I'm wondering about these giant skyscrapers.
In New York, you mean?
Well, New York, Toronto,
Right by Central
Montreal.
Park,
Well, in southern U.S. where they have all this winds and tornadoes, I have been wondering for a while. For example, is when is architecture going to adopt some of the aerodynamic features that we've seen? On planes, boats, even on big trucks, to be able to withstand this kind of pressure that they face, winds, tornadoes. Seriously, for a lot of civil engineers, I think this is going to be an interesting head scratcher in terms of how do we redesign our cities, our infrastructure to withstand these new challenges.
Yeah, isn't it Chicago where they figured out that the way they've built the buildings is creating these wind tunnels in the city? Is that
Chicago?
Yeah. Okay, anyway.
So they call it a toddling town.
Or the wind city.
Windy City, yeah. But that's something to think about. And of course, if you have any thoughts on this, as always, drop us a line here at the link, and we'll be glad to mention that and take a look at whatever you have to say.
But don't forget, Chicago's right on a big lake too, man.
Yeah.
It's right on the lake.
As are several of Canada's major cities
Yeah.
too.
As is
But this is a lake. I mean, we only have a little river running by us here.
Yeah, but it's
We're
the end
an
of the
island.
line of the great.
At least we're not Buffalo. That's what you got to be thankful for. Buffalo never gets away.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on. We are going to talk about politics now. We're going to skip the little music in the intro. But we're going to go right to politics because we have a federal election coming up. And as I said, that's expected to come possibly next week and surely the week after.
The latest is September 15th when they can launch the election.
Yeah, so that's...
That's next week.
Yeah, and of course it's a tactical thing.
It's next Sunday.
They're deciding whether it's better to call it now or at the last minute kind of thing. Anyway, the landscape is...
I'm interested. What difference does it make, Mark? Is that what you're going to deal with?
No, because if you remember correctly, in 2015, the Conservatives, which had lots of money, said, we're going to have a very long campaign. And because it's long like that, we have more money we can spend, and the others will run out of money.
Okay.
And that was it turned out to be a tactical error. So,
well,
this time,
it gave Trudeau the opportunity to shine. And it was the longest.
It was the longest
federal campaign, 78 days.
Yeah. So now, as you said, September 15th is the last day. They must call it by September 15th. So we're expecting that to happen pretty soon. Now, as I said, the landscape has changed in Canada with the arrival of a brand new national political party. In the right, the Quebec separatist bloc seems to be coming back from near oblivion last time. The tiny Green Party with only 2 members.
Getting bigger, though.
Well, they're riding the wave of this environmental concern, so they may gain some ground. The leftist New Democratic Party is trying to shake off its perennial third-party status. So anyway, I spoke to a parliamentary reporter for the Canadian Press, Jordan Press, to get some of his ideas on this. And this is what he had to say about what's going on publicly in the next little while.
Okay.
In public, what they're going to do is try to keep themselves in the news for the reasons that they want to be in the news for. So for the Liberals, what you can expect and what people around the country are probably going to see over the next little while is a continuation of what's happened in August, which is a number of Liberal cabinet ministers, their parliamentary secretaries, some backbench MPs, going out, doing events on the public dollar to talk about things that they have already talked about, announcing spending that they have already previously announced, and trying to get those issues out into the public light so they can remind people what they have done recently, but also what they have done over the past couple of years and set that baseline for the campaign. The NDP are going to be going out and trying to do announcements as well, but talk about some of the things that are in their platform. Yesterday, the New Democratic leader, Jagmeet Singh, was out talking on Labor Day saying, here is what we are going to do for labor, for the federal minimum wage in this country, and how we are going to raise it. That is something that the NDP want to do so that they are seen as a viable third-party option. And meanwhile, for the Conservatives, as the official opposition, they want to make sure that there is a focus on the Liberals and on the missteps that they believe that that government has had. Talk about particularly a candidate that they had to turf last week over concerns about alleged anti-Semitic comments online. These are the kind of things that the Conservatives are going to try to do to focus on what they say are the scandals of the Liberal government and why the Liberals need to be turfed from office.
Now, a recent national survey listed environmental concerns, the cost of living, and government honesty as top voter concerns, presumably the latter due to some Liberal scandals. Now, the Liberals have also been pushing the gun control issue all year, and yet that wasn't even a concern mentioned by voters in the national survey. So is there an issue that you think might be a sleeper in this federal election?
Well, I'm sure that as a parent and as other parents would probably say that we really hope that childcare is an issue that gets on the agenda. But really at this point, it's kind of hard to say what that is, what that sleeper issue is. And usually it is something that is sitting there and it takes some event, some moment that gets a lot of focus, a lot of attention, and then causes a emotional response of some kind in the electorate that ends up becoming an issue that galvanizes public attention and then forces the parties to respond.
Jordan Press, is this election likely to be much different than previous election campaigns? Do you see anything that has changed in the landscape of elections in Canada?
Well, one, you have a new party on the scene in the sense that you have the People's Party of Canada, which is run by former Conservative Cabinet Minister Maxime Bernier. It's an upstart party, an upstart populist party that is really trying to siphon some votes, and that may show a little bit of the level of populist sentiment in this country, depending on how many votes he gets in the election. You also have the fact that the Greens are now seen as a potential third-party option in this country as opposed to the New Democrats. That seems to suggest that now you have more players on the federal scene, which adds for a different dynamic than you've seen in previous campaigns, where really it was the Liberals and Conservatives battling it out, the NDP maybe had a chance, and the Greens were seen as also Rands. The fact that you have the Bloc Québécois, which is focused in Quebec, which could make a renaissance and which could come back in this campaign after almost being decimated a couple of years ago. Again, these are things that suddenly you see a splitting of the electorate in different ways, and which could make this a much more interesting campaign in some respects. But really, the way that the polls break down, it comes down to the Liberals and the Conservatives.
And that was my conversation with Jordan Press, who is the parliamentary reporter for the Canadian Press Wire Service, and he's based in Ottawa. So we have a very interesting campaign coming up. It's kind of interesting. One of the things we talked about in the larger interview, because all these interviews that we broadcast here are excerpts of larger ones. So if you're interested in hearing a bit more, you can go to the website and get the full interviews that we have there. A lot of other interesting stories as well, so don't hesitate to look there. But anyway, one of the things that he was saying is that in this election, when we have so many parties now, because originally when Canada started, we had two parties. And then around the middle of the last century, we had three parties as the CCF formed, which eventually became the New Democratic Party. So then we had three parties for the longest time. Then along came the Bloc Québécois, the Separatist Party, which entered federal politics. And now we've got, and then the Greens, and now we've got the People's Party, this rightist kind of party. And so one of the things I asked him, I said, is this going to be like, because there are so many parties, can we still have a majority government? Because, we have the case of, like, for example, Italy, which has dozens of parties, and they have difficulty forming governments that last very long. And he was saying, what it's going to do is it'll split the popular vote, but it doesn't mean that we don't have a majority, because under our system, which is first past the post, which means whichever candidate gets the most votes, that candidate wins, even if he doesn't get a lot of votes. If he gets more than the next guy or the next woman, then he or she becomes the candidate and occupies that riding. For example, in 2015 and in 2011, the last two major elections, the majority parties, first the Conservatives and then the Liberals, only got 39% of the popular vote. So that means, and people are often saying, yeah, but that means 60% of the people didn't vote for these guys, which is kind of true. But because of the first past the post, with 39%, they were able to elect a majority of leaders, a majority of candidates, and they formed the majority government in both cases, 2011 and 2015.
And the Liberals completely bungled their promise to introduce some kind of a
electoral reform,
some form of representative or another form that to reform this thing that we have inherited from the British system, first past the post. It would be interesting to see. I mean, I'm really curious to see how this new populist, the right of center populist party, does, whether it actually siphons off support from the Conservative Party, which itself is an amalgamation of the progressive conservative and what was the reform, the alliance. So I'd be very interested to see whether this actually splits the right. But in the left of the center, you have three parties going for the same, pretty much for the same of the electorate. So you have the Liberals, you have the NDP, which is more left of center, and now you have Greens, who are kind of left of center, but probably somewhere between the Liberals and the NDP. And the NDP has been gaining steam and. It's been a bit of a controversy lately. Was there the NDP deputies or candidates in New Brunswick? So you actually see now the NDP and Greens going after each other. So I'd be very, very curious to see what happens there as well.
Now, for listeners in other countries, when we talk about left and right in Canada, basically all our political parties are pretty close to the center.
Yes.
It's more slightly to the right or slightly more to the right or slightly to the left or slightly more to the left. So we don't have like definite leftist or definite rightist parties in this country.
Well, the People's Party of Canada is probably going to be on the right side of the spectrum.
Yes.
And the NDP would be, which is a social democratic party, would be on the left side of the spectrum. We don't have a strong Communist Party in Canada. We don't have, strong really right-wing parties in Canada. They're all very marginal. Yeah. So it seems to be a lot is gathered in the center, and that center gets very crowded.
So it comes down to television and the leaders, right?
Well, that's the thing. I think in politics,
if they're all in the middle, no?
Pretty much. They're as we said, there's the center, and then you have a couple of parties on the right, a little bit more right than the other, and on the left, and a little bit more left than the other. But we don't have, as Levon said, we don't have a right-wing party, and we don't have a left-wing communist-type party. So.
Well, Bernier's going pretty far right. I mean, when you start attacking Greta, you wonder who he's appealing to there.
Anyway,
we had that talk yesterday, Levon and I.
So anyway, the election is coming in this country. It promises to be an interesting one, and we'll be certainly talking about that in the weeks to come, because the actual vote is determined only about a month from now, a little bit more than a month.
21st.
From now. 21st of October, right? So between now and then, we'll be talking a lot about that. We'll come back and we'll talk about children in this country after a short musical break. Now, Terry, both you and I have done stories this week, kind of worrisome stories, actually, about the state of a lot of children in Canada. And now I reported on a study by UNICEF about the Canadian Index of Child and Youth Well-Being, and it found, among other things, that only 55%, only about half of children in this country reported that they were satisfied with their lot in life, or they have a high satisfaction with their lot in life. But a lot of other people, about 30% of these children, and we're talking from, when they can talk and express themselves up to age 18, so young people as well, 27% said that they are sad or hopeless for long periods of time. Now, that's basically the tip of the iceberg. What did you have?
Well, essentially, it confirmed that. I did a story on a study called Raising Canada Election 2019. It was commissioned by Children First Canada, which is a nonprofit in Calgary. And, the biggest problem for children is accidents and preventable injuries. That's a lot of kids die that way. The second one was really sad, Mark. I mean, the research revealed that suicide is the second greatest threat to a child's well-being in Canada. Suicide, kids. I mean, I know everything's hyper when you're a kid and everything's multiplied, the emotions, but this is really scary. 1 in 5 kids in Canada seriously considered suicide in the past year. That's according to Sarah Austin, the CEO of Children First Canada. Canada ranks 25th out of 41 wealthy countries in 2017 for children's well-being. According to Indigenous Services Canada, suicide rates are 5 to 7 times higher for First Nations youth. Okay? It's just awful. And then the Inuit, the rate of suicide among Inuit youth is 11 times the national average. It's one of the highest in the world. So, and Miss Austin, the reason they put this out is because of the election coming up, and you mentioned an issue possibly being a sleeper issue being childcare. This is real childcare. I spoke to Miss Austin of Canada First about the possibilities of taking some kind of political action. I can't get the statistics about the suicides of young people, regular people, and First Nations people and the Inuit out of my mind. What is going on, and has it always been this way? Is it just that the stats are better now?
Well, sadly, the statistics in the Raising Canada report that we've just released are deeply disturbing. I think are shocking to most Canadians. We tend to think of this as being one of the best places in the world for kids to grow up, and this report clearly paints a different picture. The leading cause of death being accidents and injuries, most of which are preventable, followed by suicide. Far too many kids in our country falling behind by things that we know how to solve, and simply lacking the political will to take action. And you ask the question: Are things getting better, worse off? Sadly, things are getting worse for Canada's kids. We have dropped to 25th place out of 41 wealthy countries, and that's down from where we were several years ago. We are going backwards rather than forwards. One bright light has been some progress around child poverty. We've seen several 100,000 kids lifted out of poverty in recent years because of a deliberate effort on the part of the federal government. But still, well over 10% of kids in our country growing up in poverty, and 50% of First Nations kids growing up in poverty. It's appalling, and it's got to change.
How do you bring about change? I know that you brought this report out because we've got an election coming up. You're thinking you're going to be able to put some pressure on politicians. But how much help do you need, and how much organizing do you have to do to get people to face this crisis? And it's what it is. It's a crisis.
It sure is. And, sadly, kids' issues rarely make it to the top of the radar during the federal election, and we really are hoping to change that narrative this time around. The Raising Canada report released by Children First Canada, is endorsements from Canada's leading children's charities, kids' hospitals, major corporations that invest in kids. We are speaking with a united voice. Kids can't vote, but they represent a quarter of our population, and they deserve to be heard. We need to speak up, and I hope that Canadians who hear this story will be educated, informed, and speak out on behalf of our kids. When candidates come knocking on your door, as you head into all candidate forums, it's really important to ask where each of these parties stand on these issues and what are they prepared to do to move the needle. On our website, childrenfirstcanada.com, we are publishing weekly updates on where each of these parties stand, what are they doing, what have they committed to do on each of these issues, and sadly, right now, there are a lot of gaps. We hope to see that really changing in the days and weeks ahead as we prepare to head to the polls.
Sarah Austin.
All right. And on that note, we come to the end of the program for today. As always, if you have any questions about Canada or any thoughts on any of the items you hear on the program, drop us a line. And of course, as mentioned earlier, These are all excerpts of larger interviews that we have on the website. And if you want to hear the full interviews and find out a bit more about what people had to say, take a look at the website and click on those things, and you'll get a full picture of what's going on. So as I mentioned, that's all the time we have for the show for today. For Terry and Levon and myself and Pierre and Carl and Benoit, take care until next week. Bye-bye.